ever feel like you're clinging to something so tightly it's causing you stress?
Mm-hmm.
Like that worn out t-shirt you can't bear to part with,
Yeah.
or like the need for a perfect outcome on a project.
Right.
Today we're diving deep into Buddhist teachings on detachment and letting go.
Okay.
To discover how loosening our grip might lead to a surprising amount of inner peace.
And this isn't about becoming indifferent or emotionless, which
Right.
is a common misconception.
Yeah.
The source we're exploring today dives right into the heart of this, explaining how clinging to things, possessions, relationships, even ideas of how life should be is often the root of our suffering.
It's like we're wired to grasp for things.
Right.
Thinking they'll bring us happiness.
Yeah.
But this guide suggests that's actually where our struggles often begin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struck by this idea of clinging being the source of suffering.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught in that cycle without even realizing it.
Absolutely. Think about how often you've felt anxious about losing something you have, or disappointed when things didn't go according to plan.
Right.
The source points out that this constant grasping, this desperate need to hold on to things, often creates more pain than pleasure.
Wow.
It's like we're adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
Which is remarkably similar to the Pali word for clinging.
Okay.
Upadana, literally meaning picking up fuel.
Wow, that's such a powerful image.
Right.
It's like we're actively feeding our own suffering without even realizing it.
Yeah.
And this ties directly into another key Buddhist concept this guide explores.
Okay.
Anicca, or impermanence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea that everything is in a constant state of flux. Nothing lasts forever.
Right.
We might know this intellectually.
Yeah.
But how often do we actually live as if it's true?
All the time, right.
Yeah.
I know I've definitely had moments where I was clinging to a certain outcome or resisting change with everything I had, only to realize later it was a futile battle.
The source highlights how that resistance, that inability to accept the ever-changing nature of life, is a surefire path to frustration and suffering.
Right.
It's when we learn to accept impermanence, to embrace the ebb and flow of life, that we find a path to greater peace.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if we understand that clinging leads to suffering,
right,
and that everything is always changing, how do we actually start letting go?
Right.
I mean, where do we even begin to put this into practice?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This guide provides a framework for letting go in 4 key areas of our lives.
Okay.
And it might surprise you, but they're not as abstract as you might think.
You mentioned that the guide we're exploring provides a framework for letting go in 4 key areas.
Yeah.
What are those areas?
Okay.
And how can we start applying these principles in our daily lives?
Well, the guide breaks it down into possessions, expectations, the past, and the ego.
Okay.
These might seem pretty distinct at first.
Yeah.
But I think you'll find they're more interconnected than they appear.
Let's start with possessions.
Okay.
This one feels especially relevant in our consumerist culture, where we're constantly bombarded with messages to buy more, have more, be more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The source really dives into this idea of simplifying our lives.
Yeah.
Challenging us to examine our relationship with material things. It emphasizes the practice of generosity.
Okay.
Suggesting that true happiness isn't found in accumulating more stuff, but in detaching from it.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that old saying, the things you own end up owning you.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And it's not just about physical clutter.
Right.
What about the expectations we place on ourselves and others?
Sure.
It feels like a breeding ground for clinging and potential suffering.
You're spot on.
Yeah.
The source frames this as learning to accept life on life's terms.
Okay.
Which is definitely easier said than done.
Right.
It challenges us to let go of the need to control outcomes, to loosen our grip on how we think things should be, and instead embrace the uncertainty and beauty of what is.
It's like we're constantly writing a script for our lives.
Right.
And then we get frustrated or disappointed when the actors don't follow it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more attached we are to that script,
the
more we suffer when things deviate from it.
Okay.
This guide encourages us to ask ourselves, what if we let go of the script and embraced improvisation instead?
That's such a powerful shift in perspective.
Right.
And what about the past?
Okay.
How does holding on to past experiences,
Sure,
especially painful ones, contribute to our suffering?
This one is so important.
Yeah.
The guide emphasizes forgiveness,
Okay.
both of ourselves and others, as a key aspect of letting go of the past.
Right.
It reminds us that holding on to past hurts is like carrying around a backpack full of rocks. Wow.
It weighs us down and prevents us from moving forward freely.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice to release that weight.
Okay.
And create space for healing and growth.
It's not about condoning what happened,
Right.
but choosing to free ourselves from the burden of carrying it with us every step of the way.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not defined by our past experiences unless we choose to be.
Right.
This source really emphasizes the power of choice in our journey of letting go.
Okay, so we've covered possessions,
Right.
expectations,
Yeah.
and the last area this guide dives into is letting go of the ego.
Okay.
This one feels a bit more abstract.
Sure.
Can you break it down for us?
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The source starts by challenging our understanding of the ego. It argues that this fixed sense of self, the I, we often cling to so tightly, is actually an illusion.
Wow.
A story we tell ourselves.
Okay.
And clinging to that story.
Right. Trying to protect it at all costs is often what leads to suffering.
Yeah.
It's not who we are at our core.
So it's about detaching from that story.
Yeah.
From that need to be right.
Right.
To be perceived a certain way, to have it all figured out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This guide encourages us to question the narratives we create about ourselves and to recognize that true freedom comes from releasing the need to defend a fixed sense of self.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're constantly evolving, changing, and growing.
Right.
And that's okay.
This is all making a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I imagine some of our listeners might be wondering,
Sure.
Okay, but how does this play out in relationships?
Right.
Doesn't detaching from our ego contradict the idea of forming deep, meaningful connections with others?
That's a common misconception.
Yeah.
And the source addresses it head on.
Okay.
It emphasizes that detachment in relationships isn't about becoming emotionally unavailable or pushing people away, but rather about showing up with more presence and authenticity.
Okay.
It's about learning to love without needing to possess or control.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do we find that balance between healthy detachment and emotional unavailability in relationships?
Right.
How can we know if we're on the right track? So much of what we've been discussing feels like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
How can we tell the difference between healthy detachment, this idea of accepting people for who they are, and just being emotionally checked out?
It's a dance, for sure.
Yeah.
But the source gives a great example.
Okay.
Imagine a relationship where one person is constantly trying to change the other to mold them into their ideal partner.
Right.
That's a clear sign of clinging and attachment.
Okay.
True detachment, on the other hand, is about allowing the other person the freedom to be themselves fully.
Right.
It's about loving them without needing them to be a certain way or fulfill our expectations.
Right.
It's not about what we can get from the relationship. Okay. But what we can contribute, how we can show up authentically.
It's about celebrating their growth and evolution.
Yeah.
Even if it means those paths diverge at some point.
Right.
It reminds me of the quote, if you love something, let it go.
Yeah.
If it comes back to you, it's yours forever. If it doesn't, then it was never meant to be.
What a perfect illustration.
Yeah.
And the source emphasizes that this kind of unconditional love, this acceptance, actually leads to deeper, more meaningful connections.
So it's not about less connection.
Right.
But a different quality of connection.
Exactly.
One that's rooted in freedom and respect.
Yeah.
Rather than neediness or control. This is all incredibly insightful.
Right.
If we can wrap our heads around all of this, the clinging, the impermanence, the letting go, what does the source say we ultimately gain?
Okay.
What's the payoff of all this inner work?
This guide doesn't hold back on the potential benefits. It talks about experiencing greater emotional freedom and a profound sense of inner peace.
Right.
There's this idea that when we let go of the struggle, the constant grasping, we create space for genuine joy and contentment to arise.
Right.
It also highlights cultivating deeper compassion for ourselves and others.
Right.
as we begin to understand the universality of our human experience.
Those are some pretty remarkable outcomes.
Yeah.
Is this realistic?
Well,
or is it a bit idealistic?
So,
what's your perspective on this?
It's important to remember that this is a practice.
Okay.
A lifelong journey. Mm-hmm. Not self-trustination.
Right.
It's not about achieving some perfect state of detachment,
yeah,
but rather about continuously showing up and making an effort to loosen the grip of these attachments that are causing us suffering.
Right.
And yes, from my experience, the benefits this source describes are very real.
Yeah.
They emerge organically as we learn to let go.
So how do we begin? Where do we even start with all of this?
The great thing is, this guide doesn't just talk about the theory of detachment.
Yeah.
It gives some really practical tools for cultivating it in our lives.
Okay.
It starts with mindfulness, this idea of paying attention to our thoughts and emotions without judgment.
Right.
Noticing when we're clinging, when we're resisting, and gently guiding ourselves back to the present moment.
So it all starts with awareness.
Yeah.
With cultivating that inner observer.
Exactly.
Okay.
And from that place of awareness, we can start to practice some of the other tools this guide offers.
Right.
Like regularly reflecting on impermanence.
Okay.
Reminding ourselves that everything changes.
Right.
Nothing lasts forever.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, and everything in between.
Right.
It can be helpful to ask ourselves, what am I clinging to right now that I might need to let go of?
We talked about simplifying our lives, practicing generosity, and being mindful of our consumption habits. Right.
Yeah. And it also emphasizes cultivating patience and non-reactivity, learning to pause before we react, to observe those initial impulses to cling or resist.
Yeah.
And then make a conscious choice about how we want to respond.
This has been an incredibly rich conversation. I feel like I have a lot to think about and hopefully let go of.
Me too.
This source reminds us that detachment isn't about rejecting life or suppressing our emotions, but rather about embracing it more fully, with more presence and authenticity.
Yeah.
It's about finding freedom within ourselves so that we can show up more fully in the world.
Beautifully said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
Sure.
What is one thing you're ready to loosen your grip on today?
Okay.
Maybe it's a worry you've been holding on to, an expectation that's no longer serving you.
Right.
Or even a physical possession that's lost its meaning. What would it feel like to simply let it go?
That's a powerful practice.
Yeah.
One small act of letting go can have a ripple effect on our lives.
Until next time, keep diving deep, my friends, and remember, in the words of the Buddha, everything that has a beginning has an ending. Make your peace with that, and all will be well.